It was a Friday afternoon, and Jesus was dead. In the climate of Palestine, at death, a body typically decomposes very rapidly. And so it was customary for them to attempt to take care of a body within 2 to 3 hours after death. The other dilemma was the disciples wanted some kind of decent burial for Jesus. They knew he had been accused and convicted of treason. And so they fully expected that Jesus would be buried in a criminal burial plot. But what they didn't seem to understand was that the crucifixion of Christ had converted 2 wealthy members of the Sanhedrin, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. And when these fellows stepped up, oh, what a difference it made. These wealthy fellows with some influence. First of all, Joseph of Arimathea approached Pilate to request burial rights for Jesus. And because of his position, his wealth, and his influence, he was successful in being granted that opportunity. In the meantime, Nicodemus, knowing that they now had opportunity to take care of the body of Jesus, Nicodemus, in a typical rich man's flair, rushed off to town to purchase burial spices and ointments. And in a typical rich man's flair, he purchased over 100 pounds of spices, ointments, and a linen cloth. And so these 2 fellows with the body of Jesus and the ingredients for embalming the body of Jesus, they rushed off to a tomb. If I'm not mistaken, I think Scripture reminds us that it was a new tomb. It was very nice that it was a new tomb because, after all, the old tombs were probably used tombs and they stunk. Jesus was placed in a new tomb. Well, once they had quickly taken care of the task, knowing that the Sabbath was soon to approach, these fellows left the tomb to observe the Sabbath. Well, in the meantime, there was a small group of ladies. And you know how it is when men do a woman's job. Women typically aren't content until it's done over, and usually for good reason. And so there was a group of ladies that stepped up. And they said, we want to make sure this is done right. But by then it was the Sabbath. And so they needed to wait until the Sabbath had come to a conclusion with the setting of the sun Sabbath evening. And they now went shopping. They rushed to the bazaars and the shops where the shop owners seeking to do anything to make a few extra dollars would open their shops on Sabbath evening after sunset. And so the ladies went Sabbath evening and went shopping and found their embalming supplies. But by the time they had gathered those, it was far too late to go to the tomb and to accomplish their mission. And so they waited. Probably a very sleepless night. They waited till early the next morning. Sunday morning, And that brings us to our scripture for this morning. It happens to be found in Mark chapter 16. And that's going to be kind of our home base here this morning. As we come to Mark chapter 16, as they came to the tomb and as we come to our text, we find the fascinating story. And I'd like to suggest it's tremendously practical. We see incredible spiritual implications in this story as it regards the dramatic accomplishment of our salvation. But I'd like to suggest there's something more practical here. More practical in the experience of those ladies as they came to that tomb on Sunday morning. There's some fascinating details about their experience. And we find it all in Mark chapter 16. And I'd like to begin there by rereading some very familiar verses, beginning with verse 1. And when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome had bought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. And when they said among themselves, who shall roll us away the stone from the door of the sepulchre? I would like for that massive stone, and it was a massive stone. If you've done a little bit of research in Palestinian culture, burial traditions at that time, not only were most tombs embedded in stone, but large round stones were used to seal the tombs. And this large round stone, probably close to the size of a tractor tire, placed in a groove on an uphill slant so that when it was unblocked, it would be allowed to roll down in front of the tomb, supposedly to be there for infamy. That's the stone we're talking about. I'd like to propose that chances are every one of us had stones weighing on our minds and hearts this week. Stones that we may very well have had no idea how it's going to be moved. Massive stone that confronts these ladies, massive stones that weigh so heavily on our hearts and minds as we come to worship this morning. There's probably some of you that it's so heavy that you can't even concentrate on what the preacher is saying. That's how heavy and how intense it is. I think these ladies know something about heavy stones and how much of a burden they can create. And so these ladies came, and that kind of leads us as we follow them early on this Sunday morning. That brings us to our theme. And our theme is simply this: facing life's problems. It begins by facing the problem, doing our best with God's help, and trusting that God will do the rest. That seems to be the profound insight that this story gives us. And it all comes through the experience of these ladies. The fact that they, number one, they faced their problem. They didn't ignore it. They didn't deny it. They didn't run from it. But they faced it. that takes amazing courage at times. They faced it. Notice verses 2 and 3 again. And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came. Oh my, that word came carries an incredible message. They came. They came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun, and they said among themselves, who shall roll us away the stone from the door of the tomb? Two very significant words in those two verses that I hope you won't soon let go of, and that is the fact that they came. They had no idea how they were going to solve that problem. If they even knew that the stone was there, what little they knew about it led them to believe that there was no way under God's heaven that they were going to be able to move it. That's kind of the way it is with ladies, especially my wife, when it comes to pushing something heavy and blocking wheels and taking care of heavy issues with equipment and burdens. Ladies aren't inclined to gravitate towards taking care of heavy things. But they came. They came and they asked a question. They came as far as they could, and they asked a very significant question. May I suggest that this is a lady's question? Do you remember what it is here in verse 3? And they said among themselves, who shall roll us away the stone from the door of the tomb? By the way, you know what fellows are inclined to ask in similar situations? How? How am I going to do this? There's got to be a way to take care of it. And if I just knew how to do it, I will do this. I will figure it out. I will take care of it. We fellows spend most of our lives trying to discover the wisdom that these ladies demonstrated very early in life. And the question that we ought to be asking is not how, but who. Who can help us? Who can we go to? Who is there that God can use to help us solve this problem? And as they ask that question, I would remind you that it's very conspicuous when a couple is struggling in their relationship. And it finally reaches a boiling point. And she has come to the conclusion that something's got to be done. Otherwise, it's going to all come apart at the seams. And so she begins to ask that question, who can help us? He's probably not there yet. And if he ever participates in any counseling sessions with her, it's probably because he's been drug in by dragging his heels. Because that's the way we men are. We are very reluctant to seek help. But there are some issues that are too big for us. And we, in our male pride, are very slow to admit that. It wouldn't be so tragic if the fact wasn't that it's kind of an unchristian attitude. Because chances are I'll never reach out to God for His help when I am so convinced that I can somehow solve this problem on my own. So that's the question that these ladies ask. And what it does, it reminds us that before I'm ready to reach out for God's strength, I need to see my own weakness. I need to recognize my own brokenness. When I have found the courage to recognize my own weakness and my own brokenness, then I am ready to turn to God for help. But I've got to face it first. Do you see that embedded in this story? The ladies first faced the problem. That's kind of like what happened in the therapy session that a therapist by the name of Eugene O'Neill was conducting. And you've probably all heard of, if not participated in, family encounter sessions where there happens to be a member of the family that just isn't getting it. They don't understand the pain and the grief that they're causing for the entire family. So a therapist will sometimes have the entire family come in and sit down with his family member to try and help the reality of the situation sink in for the individual that seems to be the source of the pain. Well, that's kind of what was going on with Eugene O'Neill. He was a facilitator of these confrontations sessions. And so here he had gathered a group, and after Eugene O'Neill, as a facilitator, knowing the background of every individual in the group, each individual, by the way, had experienced or participated in or been a part of a serious crisis. And one of the individuals in this particular group was an ex-police lieutenant. And since he had been dismissed from the police force because of dishonesty, he was a dishonest cop. But he just wasn't accepting that fact. And so his employer had required that he come and sit in with these sessions and participate in these sessions before they would even consider readmitting him to employment. And so here he is, very resistant and downright uncomfortable. And sure enough, it came his turn to be on the hot seat. And so O'Neill, the therapist, gently but firmly introduced the crisis, the issues that this police officer had. And from the outset, he refused to accept it. In spite of all the information that had been gleaned, the witnesses that had been interviewed, the information that the therapist had, the former police officer refused to accept it. He simply refused to see his own weakness. Therefore, he was never helped. He was never readmitted. He could not accept his own weakness. He could not face it. And so if I am a husband that is harsh and dictatorial, I'll never become a better husband until I admit my weakness. If I am a wife that waste money. And so the family budget struggles. Things will never really change until she admits it. If I have a temper and I lash out, I will never really move in the direction of change until I admit it. It's not everybody else's problem, but it's mine. I won't change until I recognize that fact. So, first and foremost, the ladies faced the issue. And they did what they came. And they came. And you notice, after they faced the problem, they didn't know the answers. But the story reminds us that most issues in life are not exacerbated because we don't have the answers, but because we don't incorporate the answers that we know. So they went as far as they could and did what they could. And Desire of Ages, page 788, says, they knew that they could not remove the stone, but they kept on their way. Oh, they had no clue how to move that stone. But they had enough courage and enough honesty to go and face their problem. And when they did, they remind us that in reality, most issues in life, the stones that weigh on our hearts, it's not because we don't know the end from the beginning, but it's probably because I don't make a beginning with what I know. I can't see how I could ever get out of debt. But I could maybe see how I could save on a few things. I could begin to budget a little differently. I don't see how in the world I can ever raise my children or influence my grandchildren to be Christians in a godless world. But I do recognize that I could make sure they come to Sabbath school or exposed to biblical materials at home. I can't do a lot, and I don't know the end from the beginning, but I need, with God's help, to do what I can and then trust God to do the rest. It kind of reminds me of an old farmer sitting on his porch one summer afternoon. And he saw a cloud of dust rolling up his driveway, following the car. And initially he didn't recognize the automobile until the fella came to a stop and got out of the car and walked up to talk to the farmer. And when he did, after a few introductory pleasantries, this young man began to give this farmer a rundown on all of the things he could be doing, all of the farming practices that would contribute to his success. If he would only do all these things, crop rotation, early application of pesticides and fertilizers, and eventually some herbicides at the right time and in the right kind. If he would just do all these things, he could double his harvest. And the old farmer kind of let him wind down a little bit, and he said, "Whoa, boy. What you need to understand is that I'm only farming half as good as I already know how." Isn't that kind of the way it is in life? It's not that we need more answers, we just need to maybe apply some of the answers we know. Go as far as we can and do what we can. I don't know how I will ever improve my relationship with someone that I'm feeling alienated from. I kind of give up on it. It's the stone that weighs on my heart, but I kind of come to the place where I don't think anything will ever change. I don't have all the answers, but I have the answers that Jesus gave us in Matthew 18. And if I follow that, if I go as far as I can, I may lo and behold discover that God has already taken care of the rest. That's kind of what happens in the story. When I face my problem and avoid the tendency to blame others, and I go as far as I can, applying the solutions that I know with God's help, lo and behold, I just may have a very similar experience to these ladies. You know, they came looking, expecting to find a dead body. And instead, they found a risen Lord. They came expecting to find a stone preventing them from accessing the tomb. And lo and behold, what did they find? And when they looked, they saw that the stone was rolled away. They came expecting to find a stone, and instead they found a story that moved the world. Wow. What an experience. What a story. In just a few words. They found so much more than what they would have ever hoped or expected because they trusted God to do the rest. Now, when it comes to trusting God to move the stone, I'll have to admit, He doesn't always move the stone, does He? No, sometimes He leaves the stone. But He may move the stone. And when He moves the stone, the same power that moved the stone may be used to help you successfully cope with a stone that's never moved. I don't know about you, but I like the first option a lot better. It's a lot more fun to have the stones moved. And it was moved. In fact, the New English Bible in verse 4, it translates it this way. It says, and they found that the stone was already moved. Before they even started to the tomb, God already had an answer. And it kind of reminds me of Isaiah 65, verse 24. Before they call, I will answer. He's already there, waiting for us to come. If we'll only come and face whatever challenge is facing us. But as I said, sometimes He doesn't move the stone. He leaves it there, and I would submit, while it's not near as much fun to not have the stone removed, it's a lot more beneficial. Because this story also reminds us that the power that removed the stone can sometimes empower us to deal with stones. In fact, it's fascinating. You may want to look at the front of your bulletin. This story found in Matthew chapter 28. As you read those verses there, you notice that it adds an interesting detail. It says, they came to the tomb and found the stone not only set aside, but the angel was sitting on it. I'd like to suggest that indicates the power that God supplied through these angels. The picture I get, it's kind of like you or I flicking a pebble or a matchstick to the side. That's kind of what these angels did. Immense power. May I suggest as we draw to a close that kind of power is still readily available for you and I. Maybe not to move the stones, the obstacles, the barriers, the burdens, but the power and the strength to cope. And it's a lot more beneficial and a lot more practical simply because that's how we grow. I probably don't grow very much when the stone is just cast aside. But when I have to learn to cope with it and deal with it, I learn to trust God in a different way. In a different way. When the stone isn't moved and I have to cope with it. So there you have it. Beautiful story that illustrates the realities of life. Not just when these ladies lived there in Palestine, but the realities that you and I live with. And it reminds us that if we but find the courage to face our weaknesses and our challenges head on, and if we go towards the solution as far as we can go, maybe can't go very far, maybe can't do very much, but by God's grace and with His help, I'll do the little bit I can. And when I do, I will discover that God has already been there and is supplying the solution that I need. Maybe not to move it, but to give me the courage and the strength to cope with it. That brings me to a story about a man named Bob, a young man, had joined the military. And having joined the military, he did have some serious concerns. He was just immensely enthusiastic about joining the military, but there was a nagging concern on his heart. And that was, he was a conscientious Seventh-day Adventist Christian. And if you're a conscientious Seventh-day Adventist Christian, there are some provisions, some allowances made. And his recruiter had indicated that to Bob, so he knew it was unreasonable to expect those privileges while he was still in boot camp. But once he had finished boot camp and was moved into his next training phase, he knew it was now or never. He needed to make a request for a Sabbath allowance that it would allow him to go and worship on Sabbath in a nearby church. And so the very first week, the nagging concern at his heart, and he knew what he needed to do. It was simply a matter of making his way across the base to the first sergeant's office and approach the first sergeant. But Monday he thought, well, I have Tuesday. Tuesday he thought I have Wednesday. Wednesday he thought he had Thursday. Before he knew it, it was Friday. And he didn't have his Sabbath allowance, his Sabbath permission slip. Well, he knew it was too late once Friday had come, too late to approach the first sergeant. So he wrestled literally with his conscience through that first weekend. Finally, God gave him a bit of courage after praying through that first weekend. And finally, by Monday of the next week, he took himself by the scruff of the neck and said, I need to go face this. And even as he did, he was worried that his buddies would laugh at him. The first sergeant wouldn't understand. But in spite of that obstacle, he made his way over to the first sergeant's office after he'd made an appointment to meet with him. He walked in, he met with him, and that's when he discovered that God had already moved the stone. The sergeant said, I heard you were coming. I've already submitted the request to the lieutenant across the base. If you'll just go across the base to his office, he will grant you your permission slip for Sabbath allowance. And as he walked out of that first sergeant's office, and later out of the lieutenant's office. Oh, I tell you, he knew from firsthand experience that God knows something about handling stones. That's our God. That's how incredible, the incredible ways that he can help us, if not move stones, at least cope with stones. May we, by God's grace, have the courage to face them. And when we do, and go as far as we can, may you also, lo and behold, discover that's where God performs his miracles, of either moving them or giving us the strength to cope. With that in mind, we're going to sing our closing hymn.